Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming along and for joining me this evening from wherever you are. I recognise quite a few names who've registered from across Queensland and South Australia and New South Wales. Thank you very much. My name's Alistair Rayner. I'm the principal of Rayner Ag, a independent beef cattle advisory service. I work with Seabird Labs as the National Extension Manager. I also do a little bit of writing for Beef Central as a genetics editor. But my principal focus is really working with producers to manage their individual enterprises to achieve their outcomes. And part of what we do quite a lot is really looking to try and have better responses to drought and being much more prepared about how we respond to drought. I this evening would like to take you through some ideas and some suggestions that have come out of our experiences during the drought that we went through from the end of 2015 in some cases right through to 2020. And while there are people who have probably progressed a little bit further along the path, for everyone else, there's an opportunity to come back and review some of the experiences that we've had in the past and to look at what we can actually try and do to manage and be more responsive to a drought situation as we go. I'm going to start my slides now and take you through. Just for those of you who would like to ask questions, if you can type them in the chat box and we will actually come to them at the end, and I'll work through them as we go. So September 2023, for those of you who've been in southern New South Wales, the Central West or elsewhere, you'll know that we're experiencing abnormal heat conditions, and that's really starting to put a lot of pressure on people for a number of different reasons, both from a feed perspective, but also from a livestock welfare perspective in terms of providing water and making decisions about how to manage cows with calves and so on. So it is a good time to actually stop and think a little bit about what we'd like to try and achieve tonight. And there are really four key things that I'd like to work through. The first is to try and produce a better level of opportunity for you to take stock of your current position. I want to touch again on some of our past experiences and putting them to work for us in this period to set some clear trigger points that will be appropriate for your location and to give you a framework that might help you in terms of prioritizing and making decisions about your circumstances. During the drought in 2018 and 2017, one of the things that I really learned speaking to producers across New South Wales and Queensland was that there were things that were starting to just get away from us in a lot of situations. And I think that the 6 key points I have here really can't be underestimated. It is incredibly important that we stop and have a break and reassess our actual position and reassess what we're trying to achieve and what we're actually doing. I think that one of the challenges, particularly as we start to really work into situations such as a drought, is that we get so busy being busy that we sometimes lose focus on what we're trying to achieve, and we get caught up in a treadmill that makes decisions much harder, and we start to feel much more out of control in our circumstances. If you can actually physically stop and reassess and do it in a way that allows you to be clear about what you're trying to achieve, it does make a big difference. It is essential to have a plan. Now, a plan is really the framework to help you understand if you're using your time and your resources wisely. We all have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of resources. And it's often the case that when we don't have a plan and we are spinning from one thing to another, that we start to waste our time and we start to see our resources being stretched and utilized very badly. And that's where waste and bad decisions then start to impact upon the overall survival of the business. Planning is really important to help you prioritize. We are very good, as I said, at being busy. We get busy being busy. But it's important to actually have some priorities. What are the must-dos on your business? What are the shoulds and what are the coulds? And quite often, most of our attention is going on the coulds or the shoulds. We really need to be clear about what our must-dos are and get those under control. And then we can start to then think about where to go to next. Consider your health. I have long thought that this should be my number one point. Throughout 2017 and 2018, the number of injuries that I became aware of with producers who, because they were tired, because they were stressed, because they were anxious, were not paying as much attention as they should have been to some of the things that they were doing. Injuries around machinery, around tractors, moving grain, moving feed, livestock handling, lots of things just sort of slipped by and people started to really get injured. The other thing is also to think about just your general health. I know we want to soldier on and do this, but it is incredibly important. And I think it is really something we should all make as part of our drought response. And part of that then is be safe. When we got to the situation where people were starting to get quite desperate and were cutting trees for fodder and so on, I'm sure there were a few people who thought that they were still 21 and they were trying out for Ninja Warrior. We're not as young as we used to be in a lot of cases, and climbing around trees with chainsaws and ladders on backs of utes and other things is really not safe. If you stop and think about it, think about really, what are you trying to do? And is there a better way, or is there a safer way, or is there something totally different before you resort to doing that? And finally, think about taking a break and making sure that you do take a break. One of the things that a lot of people really experience throughout a drought is this thing called change blindness. We see the same thing day after day after day. And after a while, we don't notice how difficult things have become, on how poor our animals are starting to be, or how little ground cover we start to have. Going away for even 2 or 3 days and coming back to reset really does give you an opportunity to go back to your plan and come at it with a fresh approach and maybe be much more effective in doing it. We know that those 6 points really worked for quite a lot of people, and I'm still very confident that they work regardless of what we go into in the next few months. One of the challenges for a lot of people in terms of the approach to droughts is the challenge around making decisions. And I used to think a lot about this, and someone once gave me a quote, which was that when you're under a mortar attack, any direction you jump in is a good direction, because if you stay still, you'll just get blown up. And I think that for a lot of people during the drought, there becomes a point where we just don't want to make decisions anymore. And because of that, everything then just keeps rolling on, and all of a sudden you're in a very, very difficult situation. So making decisions can be made easier if you can be able to structure yourself so that you actually set a date and stick to it. Really important to get what I call a sanity check. Ask your partner and your team to be involved in what you're looking to do. Look for their input and their ideas, because they might see things differently to you. It is really important to control your curiosity. I know we all like to know what everyone else is doing and worrying about what's happening in other states and other centres, but you really need at this time to focus on what you need to know for your location. Remember, there's never going to be a perfect time. We have to just accept that there'll never be a perfect time, and that we've made a date and we're going to stick to it. Finally, the important thing is to break it into some manageable parts so you can focus on the must-dos and look at then the shoulds and coulds as we go. So those are, I think, my key messages, that after 3.5 years of the last big drought, and really, I guess, a career of working through droughts with producers across New South Wales, I think they're the ones that actually work and have consistently worked for producers. When we look at taking the big picture, we're looking at what the BOM's actually looking to try and do. So the BOM offers data on rainfall, as we know, and there's lots of variation in averages across the country. And we look at this BOM data from the recent run in August 2023. Can see that there are areas across the country that have actually got some of the highest rainfall on record, and equally some of the areas that just hold me for a second, and I'll make sure that I'm actually sharing my slides with you. That would probably be handy. Apologies for that. So, trusty, it's always good when things don't work quite as you would like to do. So if we go back to where we're actually looking at the BOM data, but just quickly to go back through those key points that I'm really keen for you to think about in terms of having your plans, making sure that you prioritize, considering your health, taking a break, but also then in terms of making our decisions and looking to try and stick to dates and have manageable parts. Now, if we look at the Bureau of Meteorology's recent reports, which was where I was just starting to work towards, if we take the bigger picture, we look at what the recent rainfall has been across the country, you'll see that for much of central Queensland, that rain has been well below average. There's been patches in the northwest and up through elsewhere where it's been average. In New South Wales, very similar story. And when we go into Victoria, below average and very, very below average. And that really, I guess, has started to put a lot of pressure on people as they start to think, well, what does this really mean? I guess from my perspective, that's useful to know that there has been these rainfall records that we can start to make some assumptions about what that might mean for pasture growth. But it doesn't always tell the picture about how much pasture is actually available for us. What we're looking at when we start to think about this is trying to make some assumptions of where the rain might have fallen, given that pasture growth is influenced by other things besides just rainfall. And so the opportunity to go through and work through something like a satellite imagery, which is allowing us to actually see what is on the ground and make those assessments on an objective and regular basis to actually see how much feed is available across the country, and also to then start to use that as part of our planning process. Now, this product and this map that I'm showing you at the moment is part of a new tool that we're releasing out of CBO Labs, which is called our regional comparison. And we're able to use the regional comparison to start to look at regions on a closer level and a more detailed level to see how they're actually performing in terms of pasture. So if we have a look at this particular slide here at the moment, and what you'll see is that we can zoom in or out and we can change our layers. So if I was to change that layer to our total, this is the amount of total standing dry matter that is actually available for grazing purposes or for other purposes across the country at this point in time. It does take into account the crops that are growing in the cropping areas. It's taking total standing dry matter and it's excluding tree cover. We could go back and look at these updated on a 5-daily basis, and we can start to see those particular changes as the season has been progressing across the country. You can change your layers, and we can go from total standing dry matter to looking at our comparison. How is our season ranking against the long-term average? And you can look to see what that might be meaning for your decisions around your own location, but also about some future planning. We can, if you like, be able to look at the green, the total amount of green, and you can zoom in as close as this level here. We can see the major towns. Really important to point out that these levels of total standing dry matter, red doesn't mean that it's dead. Red means that it's well below 250 kilos of dry material dry matter in that location. So that's green dry matter. If you wanted to look at what's actually driving the system, we could change that to dead or dry material. And you'll see that the bulk of this material through this Hunter region or elsewhere, if we go across to some of the western areas, is being driven. The total standing dry matter is really being driven by the amount of dead feed that is actually there in that location. So you're able to actually look at these layers. And if you wanted to change that and base it on a catchment basis, if you're interested to know, you can start to do that. So this will be available from the CBO Labs website, and you can start to use that and look at those comparisons as we go forward from this point. So when we look at that, I guess on a broader basis, it's very useful to actually be able to say that's what's happening nationally. And some people get very hung up about that. But as I've said, it's really important to control your curiosity. So it is important to be able to look at doing that so that you think about the fact that not everyone is going into drought at the same point. When we look at this location here that might be in Western New South Wales, it will be very different to the location where other people are. So there's a huge amount of variation in regions, and you have to make your assessments for your own situation and be as objective as you possibly can to use your resources to support your assessments. This image was taken at the Upper Hunter. I was there last week, and so you can see that really is a situation that in that location where there is very, very little total standing dry matter, green or dead. So it's important then to think, well, is that reflective of the whole locality? And it's important to realize that what you might be seeing there might be different for yourself. We're able to help you actually understand the variation in your location using the Australian Feed-Based Monitor. So you'll see that I've been able to look at across the Upper Hunter region of New South Wales from January this year until the start of September. And this has been the trend of the average total standing dry matter declining pretty much from about 2,100 kilos at the start of January down to just over 1,610 kilos or 1,688 kilos at the end of August. Now that's all very well, but the Upper Hunter is a fairly large place and there is a lot of variation. So if we look at 4 locations within the Upper Hunter based around Merriwa, Murrurundi, St Clair, Sandy Hollow and Gundy, you'll see that there's huge variation across the months in those locations this year. So this is an important thing for producers trying to make decisions and decide about how will they respond for their particular location. We can look at that and understand the variation. And even if we look at that average, when we just work off that average, the problem with averages is there's always going to be some that are better and some that are much worse. So while you might like to use an average to start to get a feel and a broader sense of what's happening in your region, which might help shape your decisions around marketing or prompt you to think about where you might be looking for potential for adjustment or for other decisions that are part of your drought plan, this broader data is quite useful. And the way you access this data is through your MyMLA portal. So if you don't have a MyMLA account, it's really important that you, after this webinar, remember to sign up to mymla.com.au. If you're a member or a non-member, you can have a MyMLA account. If you're a member of MLA and you have linked your LPA account with your MyMLA portal, you'll be able to access the AFM, the Australian Feed-Based Monitor, for free. If you're not a member or you're a third-party consultant, you can purchase a subscription and be able to use that as part of your business. Regardless of whether you're a member or a non-member, when you open your MyMLA portal, every time you go into doing that, you'll notice that underneath the rolling ads and above your welcome message is this monthly comparison for your chosen postcode going back to 2018. And so we're able to look at the last 6 years that we've been able to produce data for this particular location on a postcode basis. Now you can add more data into this in terms of adding other postcodes if you'd like to compare different regions, because some postcodes are incredibly broad. Postcode here 2370 is Glen Innes, but it extends from Kookabookra out on the Eastern Fall right across to almost to the Kings Plain region just out to the east of Inverell. So there's a fairly big variety of locations in there, and that data has been accumulated to present these graphs. It is useful to show you the trend of how this season is pairing up and what it might be doing in terms of traditional curves leading towards a spring or a summer or an autumn. When you look at this graph, then you have the opportunity to go through to the AFM, so to the SIBO Labs page. By signing in or signing up with your MyMLA account, you'll have your LPA linked already. And when you open through the sign-in process here, you'll be able to open the dashboard. In the dashboard, if you have particular farms, particular picks, they'll be set up here or sitting here ready to go for you to set up. You just select your farm. It will open up with a request for you to type in your location, type in your farm address, and select the land parcels that are associated with your farm. What you will then be able to do is look at the trend across your farm, taking into account your land parcels. It goes down to 1 hectare resolution. You don't get paddock level data. If you wanted paddock level data, you can subscribe to the subscription service. But the data that I'm showing you today comes out of the free service and looking at the trends that we can start to extract from this data. If you were to click on your particular farm, so to click on the AFM and have a look at this, you come to this map, which often is a little bit off-putting for people because they don't quite understand what they're looking at. Yes, I know it is grainy and it is very pixelated. That's because this particular property has a couple of 100 hectares in there, and each of those dots is 1 hectare. The labels on the side, which you'll be able to, which I can't quite fit into the screen in this presentation, allow you to see that from red is under 250 kilos of total standing dry matter through to the purple, which is in excess of 5,000 kilograms of total standing dry matter. You can change your view for your 30-day rolling average by choosing the slider bar. I use this map to look at the color changes. I'm not necessarily so hung up about the individual pixels, but if I see an ongoing and rapid change from dark greens and purples through to ambers and then into reds, I am very aware that I'm falling well below my levels of total standing dry matter, and I can see that change occurring as it spreads across over time. More importantly, if you were to select and look on where you've located this drop-down pin, which is the arbitrary farm gate, you'll be able to produce this series of graphs. And these are the graphs that I find incredibly valuable, particularly to assist us in our drought planning as we go through here. The graph at the bottom is showing you, for this particular farm, the range and the comparison month by month of total standing dry matter for all of the land parcels in this particular location, starting here with 2023, the red line, but we could go back as far as 2017. Obviously, these are the significant drought years in the upper Hunter. More importantly, what this is starting to show you is where your traditional peaks and feed troughs are, and that will help give you some guidance as to when you might think about changing your timings or when you need to be more on top of particular livestock demands for feed and matching those livestock demands to what the feed is telling you. At the top of the graph, this graph up the top is basically showing you the range of feed that grows across those locations. So the upper and lower limits. So at the moment, the lower limit is around about 881 kilos of total standing dry matter. The upper limit, the upper amount in that property is not too bad at just under 2,500 kilos of total standing dry matter. But our average, and this is probably where people want to start to make decisions using some of those averages, is sitting much closer to that 1,500 or just under 1,500 kilos of total standing dry matter. So when we look within a farm, we need to start thinking about what are our lower and upper limits, and also to maybe go back and look at how bad things were back during those drought years and think about what were the actions that you did at those points of time to manage the feed circumstances that you had. Were they the worst times, and were you able to look back and say, we should have made decisions earlier? This is when we should have made them. How reflective can you then be able to look at those in terms of the graph that you're currently seeing for this point in time? When we think about this, then part of a good plan is really about taking stock of your position. We really need to start thinking about understanding our pasture and our feed reserves, and to then be able to use those as part of a feed budget and a feeding plan. We want to actually go through and think about our livestock and what they require. And we need to also think about a proper understanding of how much water we actually have. One of the guidelines that I use to often start me thinking about decisions and where I need to start taking action is really to look at some basic pasture benchmarks for livestock. These are well-published livestock benchmarks for sheep and for cattle, and they're based on digestibility and the amount of feed in line with the digestibility that is on offer. The reason we rank this is very simple. Digestibility is directly related to the energy that is in the feed. The higher the digestibility, the greater the amount of energy that is available per kilogram of dry matter that the animal eats. If we're able to achieve dry matter intakes of energy easily, the animal gets a highly digestible, high energy feed, they will perform and grow very well. And obviously, because of that, we don't need to provide physically as much feed to the animal to meet their needs. However, as pastures start to mature, the digestibility starts to decline, so does the energy that's within that feed. The result is that we then need to increase the amount of feed on offer to compensate for that lower level of energy. However, we get to a point where at low levels of digestibility, so under 60% and down to 55% digestibility, the amount of feed that we start to offer or that is available is often greater than what, well, the animal can't physically eat enough of it. And often in those circumstances, we think about intervention in terms of attempting to try and encourage the room of the animal to be more efficient and effective using protein supplementation to speed up the rate of digestion, to allow that energy to be absorbed, but basically to try and help the animal eat more of that feed. But there will be a point where those levels of digestibility and the amounts that are actually on offer are far away from where our animals actually are. So when we look at these digestibility and pasture benchmarks, we can start to line them up very much against our curves that we've started to put together with the AFM. It's really important, I think, to understand and be realistic about your stock requirements. So while I've put those basic pasture benchmarks up there, people tend to nod their heads and say, yes, Al, and then ignore me. You really need to put it into a context, and we'll put it into this being realistic about your stock requirements. So most producers underestimate how much their animals need, and therefore are often surprised or taken aback by how much feed or how much weight their animals lose. So, for example, I looked at a typical 550 kilogram British bred cow with a 45-day-old calf on them. So pretty much in line with what is happening in the upper hunter at the moment. Her daily intake requirement is 13 kilograms of dry matter. And she requires 114 megajoules of energy per day to meet her maintenance and lactation requirements. It's a huge amount of energy that she requires, and a huge amount of feed that she has to consume to achieve those basic requirements. And if she can't physically eat enough because it's either not available or it's too low in digestibility, we start to run into some issues. And in this case, what we're starting to see is that cow is losing up to almost 1.6 kilos a day, which is effectively losing 0.6 of a body condition score a month. Every kilogram that a cow loses releases about 29 megajoules of energy back to be used for other things. So we've got quite a bit of energy being released from that cow in terms of the fat condition of fat, or eventually into muscle wastage to start to try and achieve her requirements. At the same time, our calf growth is ticking over at just around about a 0.2 of a kilo a day. So if you're realistic about that, those losses are fairly confronting, particularly when we think about the fact that we want to be joining cows. We want cows to be reconceiving, and their fatness and their body condition is really one of the integral parts of having a successful conception and successful joining period. So having this significant weight loss is a real issue. How long do you have before your animals hit a point where you need to intervene very quickly? So when we think about making choices, and if you decided that you did need to intervene, it is important to remember that all feeds have a window of usefulness. And if you're attempting to top up a feed gap, so addressing quality, you might be wanting to go in with a protein supplementation. But if you're in a position where we're starting to look at insufficient feed in general, or moving to that point, should you be planning on providing an energy feed or destocking or a combination? So if we go back to our pasture benchmarks again, and we have a look at those as a general guide and looking again at that, So you'll see that there's some very clear benchmarks as to what's suitable for a dry cow, for lactating cows, and for growing stock. And you'll see that once we get below 60% digestible, the amount of feed that we actually have to have at low levels from late pregnant cows is huge, let alone for a lactating cow. It's just not suitable. And in saying it's not suitable, it basically means that scenario I've just said before, where we're starting to see weight loss occurring. And that weight loss is contributing then to the ongoing profitability of the enterprise by impacting on fertility levels. So I took from the AFM data the monthly figures for this particular farm that I've shown you before. And you can see that green line. It's very much reflective of the red dotted line that we looked at earlier, which basically shows the curve of feed throughout the last 9 months. The red line underneath is what I call my critical threshold line, which is where under 800 kilos, you are starting to impact on ground cover and starting to have a significantly detrimental effect on the ability of your paddocks to recover and come back when the season breaks. So in effect, people have got the differential between the red line and the green line to play with. And while that looks reasonably broad, and particularly at the moment, people might be looking and go, well, it's almost 1,600 kilos, so there's 800 kilos to play with. Let's actually use the pasture benchmarks. At 60% digestible, and that blue line comes in there, that's the benchmark for dry cows. So all of a sudden, that window that we were looking to play with is, at one point in February, was touch and go. Things did improve a lot, and dry cows probably were starting to put on more than they needed because they could achieve their intake requirements. But we're really starting to look at that the benchmark between a dry cow at 1,200 odd kilos or 1,250 kilos up to that 1,600 kilos, it's fairly narrow. If we thought about trying to achieve a level of growth or to finish cattle and get rid of them, the potential benchmark of 50% of potential growth of 50% is this yellow line. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see that we're not achieving. And for most of this year, we haven't really been in position to achieve at least half of the potential of growth that we would have hoped to have achieved. So this is quite a useful little tool to start thinking about in terms of setting that for your own property. Are you then able to use that to shape your decisions and set some priorities around the stock that you'll look to keep, the stock that you'll look to feed, or the stock that you look to kill to carry onwards? It's also important to note that when we look at this particular location, there's insufficient paddock feed to meet the daily requirements of our late pregnant cows or cows in early lactation. So we know that we have got a weight loss scenario. Now, when we start to think about the choice of feeds and we start to set our plans around that, just remember that all protein supplements particularly have a window of usefulness. And we use our protein supplements very much in order to try and help our animals increase their intake and be able to improve the rate of digestibility by stimulating the rumen microflora to allow the material to be digested more effectively, to release that energy, but more importantly, to allow the animal to actually go out and graze more. The problem with our supplements is that some of them work incredibly effectively when we've got plentiful amounts of dry material, but as we eat our way into our feed reserves, the response or the effectiveness of those products tends to decline. Things like blocks, roller drums, and some of our molasses products are very good in terms of providing or carrying our cheapest form of protein, which tends to be urea, in a safe way. We get some energy from molasses, this is true, but on a dry matter basis, the amount of molasses that animals need to consume to meet their energy requirements is vast, and often it's very difficult for them to achieve that. Which is why things such as protein meals and protein pellets, lupins and white cotton seeds tend to be a very versatile feed because they often have reasonably high levels of energy as well as relatively high levels of crude protein. So we stimulate our rumen and make our rumen work. We also get the added benefit of actually getting some additional energy. So that's quite useful for us as a planner to think about what type of feed should we have on hand. And also, if we are going to feed, to invest in the products that are actually going to provide the response we need. So when we look at those windows of usefulness and we go back to looking at our graph developed from our AFM data, we lie that blue line at being the bottom of the medium window, which is between 1,500 kilos and 2,500 kilos, we've really not had an opportunity to get much use out of blocks or licks or roller drums. Yet people continue to use them and feel that they're doing a good job. And yes, you might stimulate the rumen function and you fired the rumen up to eat. There's just not enough feed there for the animal to really benefit from it. And they're still losing weight because of it, because they're using the energy deficit that has been occurred by that lack of feed to meet their energy requirements. So we really need to think about what would be suitable. And in most cases, certainly from, I guess, the end of March through to about now, the producer who would be running this farm would really have an option of using protein meals, fortified molasses brews, so cottonseed meal, molasses and urea, pellets, grains, or white cottonseed. But looking very closely at where this green line is trending at the end of August to say, well, we are almost into a position where we have gone across and below the threshold of where those supplements are actually working. And we really need to start planning to transition across into an energy feed. Once we drop down to below 1,200 kilos, there's really no point in continuing with protein supplementation. We should be really focusing on energy as the most cost-efficient way to meet our animals' requirements. So when you set a plan and you're thinking about setting a trigger point, this graph that you can develop for your own location is going to be a very useful guide to give you an idea about A, choosing the right supplements, but B, indicating to you how long you might potentially have before you need to transition to the next supplement or transition to energy. And you can do this in two ways. You can do it by this graph and look at the trend and make an assessment and a decision that you'll do it by mid-September, that you'll transition from protein across to energy. Or you can also look and do a basic feed budget. Now, MLA provides a really useful tool that's nice and cheap because it's free, sitting on the MLA website. And when we look at that, you can actually start to put your own data into this particular feed budget. So I've said that this is a 50 hectare paddock with 551 kilos of dry matter per hectare directly out of the AFM. I've assumed a pasture quality of 60%, which is at the lowest end of really usefulness. And I've said that there's about 20% wastage, which is trampling, material being weathered and lost to the overall pool of data of feed available. So that combined with a little bit of pasture growth, given that we can look and say that pasture is not actually growing, if it's doing about 2 kilos a day, we're doing very well. And I want to, at 1,200 kilos, move those animals into a feeding program. If I put cows in early lactation there and a mob of 50 in there, it's done some basic estimates around the energy requirements, but effectively the more important thing is this figure down here, which says that the number of days this particular paddock will last, and it basically is 32. So when we look at that, we've got 32 days, which is basically coming back to what I said earlier, that loss of 0.6 of a body condition score. So if you don't intervene and you allow your animals to lose weight, that's what will happen. And whether they then come to a critical point where you then start to impact upon their long-term fertility becomes the next question, the next threshold, and the next set of priorities for you. At the very least, what you've now developed for yourself is as a timeline that is based on real data. And it gives you that clear date that we talked about before, which is to make a decision and set a date and stick to it. Now, having done that, you can then plan with confidence around what you're looking to try and do. Regardless of whether it rains or not, you are not going to get the growth that you would require to support the cows in this condition. So you need to stay the course, and this timeline helps you achieve to do that. So now let's step aside from pastures and think about the next part of our program. You really have to spend some time with your cows and prioritize your cow herd. And I think it is incredibly important to, again, do this on some objective data. Identify your least productive cows. I have a couple of clients who I've done this for. I've taken their cow data and I've basically run the cow data against their weaners and developed a ranking list of the cows that are the least productive in that mod. So regardless of whether they're pregnant or not, there's a group of cows that continually produce the least amount of beef per kilogram, per 100 kilos in the paddock. They're the least productive in the herd, and they're the first that we will be looking to get rid of. But it's also important to consider your age, the structural traits and the temperament that you might have, and think about what are the traits that matter to you. When you are prioritizing a cow herd, again, in terms of objectiveness, data is always good. It's important to know and understand your condition scores. So in New South Wales and Victoria, we're very used to using our FAT score system, where we talk about FAT scores 1 through to 6. In Northern Australia and other parts of the country, we talk about our body condition scores. And we've got a basic table which allows you to be able to look and see at what point or where's the comparison between a FAT score and a body condition score. That's available in the MLA publication, which is called A National Guide to Describing and Managing Beef Cattle in Low Body Condition. And there's a very good resource for this point in terms of planning. So if we're thinking about the fact that we've got cows that might be in a body condition score of 3, and they have dropped 0.6, they are now in a body condition score of 2, which is the equivalent of a FAT score 1. So this is potentially a concern for some people. It's really important in that case to go through and sort out your cows. You can't set priorities or manage your cows when they're all boxed up, and you need to go through and draft them out on their requirements. In this particular group of cows that I worked with, there was everything from body condition scores of 4s through to body condition scores that were down to that 1 and 2 range. So for us, FAT scores from 3 down to 1. So when we looked at that, we consider anything to be at that FAT score 1.5 to 2 as being at risk. So for producers who are looking to draft up their animals, you should be starting to think about drafting those animals off and what will we actually do with those particular animals to start to think about how you might manage those as a separate group. Within that group, there's always going to be a group of animals who are lower in condition again, those high-risk 1 animals that require your intervention now and require intervention as a separate group of animals. And finally, a group that can be potentially even worse. And the problem is that not all of these animals are necessarily the ones you see all the time, but they do exist and often are mixed in and hiding within your herd. You need to sort your cows out and to do it on body condition. The MLA guide also offers some very useful tips in terms of the welfare requirements, but how you might manage those animals. So those animals that we would consider to be at risk, those body condition score 1s or getting into FAT score 1s, I call them at risk or of concern. They're lean, they're strong with evident muscle utilization. So they're wasting away and they're starting to use some of their weight. You could actually think about management intervention, which would be taking calves off them and feeding them separately. It would be feeding those. And if you were able to, you might be able to actually offload those animals to another location. However, if you have animals that are at risk or in high-risk categories, you aren't able to actually think about transporting those, and you need to think about significant risks that might come from other stresses like cold, wet events, or the ability for you to actually look after those. We really want to try and avoid having our animals slipping away into from FAT score 3s and body condition scores of 3s and 4s into these ranges here. It is really important that we start to think about that, and we need to think about the welfare and the strength of individual animals and not just through the mob. So it is important to go through and sort them out into those groups and actually have separate groups to manage them. If you do this, then you've actually starting to build a little bit of a framework about what your requirements might be. How much feed do you need to start thinking about if you actually had to start to provide these to animals? And so we do have some really good guidelines around on the basic requirements of what you might need to provide per day to animals, be it for weaners through to breeders that are lactating or to adult dry stock, whether you choose to use grain, whether you choose to use high quality hay, whether you do a mix, or what you might be expecting to achieve by doing that. Now, this little guideline is actually quite important because it's going to be useful in helping you develop an audit for yourself about how much feed you might look to need to have. We start by doing this by simply taking stock of your position. So quite simply, what feeds do you have on hand at the moment? What is it? How much of it have you got? How much paddock feed have you got? And you don't need to do your estimates necessarily now because you've got your AFM data where you can put that in. That data updated every 5 days, your 30-day rolling average is going to be much more objective and quicker for you to use than having to do a large number of pasture estimates and samples across your paddocks. Once you've done that, I'd encourage you to start off by doing just a really rough, dirty, realistic feed budget to get your head into that planning process. And in terms of that, it's really how many kilograms of feed do you need per day per head? And you can do this for each class of animals that you actually have. Do it for your weaners, do it for your lactating cows, do it for cows, and do it for calves. Do it for steers that you might be looking to grow. Do it by the number of head, what the cost per kilogram of feed is, and that total feed cost per day. Now, that's going to set you up for thinking about, is this actually realistic? And for a lot of people, doing the sums early is probably the most important thing. Rather than getting halfway down the process and running out of funds and then being forced to offload animals that they'd spent a lot of money on to feed, when maybe the decision should have been made well before the feeding process started. So when you start to take stock of your position, go through and be really honest and objective about these animals. How many first calf heifers do you have? How many cows with calves? How many dry cows? How many bulls? And how many weaners and 2-year-old steers do you have? If you have sheep, you can do the same thing with your sheep. What are the fat scores in those groups? Now ask some decisions about what you can keep and what you might sell. And you can then start to prioritize and get a list of animals that will sit on a hit list and that is really objective to take off and think about. Now, that often gets a little bit ambitious for some people because, again, people like to try and err on the side of, I've spent a lot of money to buy these cows back after the last drought. I'm going to hang on to them. But let's determine that true cost of feeding for those animals. How much feed do you require per kilogram of head per day for your heifers, for your cows with calves, or if you do dry cows and feed calves separately? If you work that out on both your cost per head per day, as well as the total feed amount that you require and your total ration cost, you can then actually start to make some objective and assessment decisions about whether you should go down the feeding path or what numbers you should look to keep. This planning process can start now, even if your feed reserves are well above the minimum thresholds that exist for your livestock. The final estimate to do is to calculate how much dam water you actually have. There's a technique that you can basically do, which is really designed around playing in the mud with some fishing sinkers and some fishing floats that are actually weighted so that you have 1 meter distances between your fishing floats and a sinker at the bottom. You drag that string across to the nearest point of the dam and just allow that sinker to drop down, and that'll tell you the depth of the dam. Excuse me. You can start to use that technique to calculate the volume of water that you have within each dam. And if you needed to, you could start to then look at then doing a water audit around how much livestock how much water your livestock are consuming, and therefore starting to think about a water audit as to how much water you might have in terms of total usable water, what your current requirement is for the stock that you're looking to keep, and whether you've got sufficient water to hold your stock and for how many days. When you do that, combining your water and your feed, you might now then start to say, well, we actually need to make some decisions, and making some decisions early rather than later. So set priority groups. Be clear about your priority groups of what you will sell and what you will feed. if you're thinking about how you might manage your cows and calves, think very much about the fact that cows have huge energy demands. So it's up to double of what a dry cow requires. We know that we can wean calves down as early as 6 weeks. Now, weaning calves is not a set forget. When you go to early weaning, it is a process that you have to do, and to do it well, otherwise you find that you'll get animals that will be sick and animals that will perish. It's really setting up a daycare in the back of your farm for a bunch of calves. And so you need to think about putting your animals into groups based on weight and size, with probably a medium, large, small group, and always a hospital pen for anything that gets sick to be pulled out straight away. You can introduce your calves to calf pellets. You can make your own mixes with grain and with meal. You should be providing roughage, and it's really not recommended that you provide full grain to little calves under 6 to 12 weeks. So again, as part of your planning, think about what you could do and how you might do it. You can provide other mixes that you can make. You can make feed out of rolled grain and loosened chaff. You can use lupins and oats. You would still provide roughage that the animals can nibble and chew at, and make sure that your animals are actually able to access troughs particularly. We'll probably spend more time, if things continue to get drier, in the Upper Hunter and the New England talking about early weaning. But just for your planning purposes, just remember that if you're building troughs or putting troughs, you now need to allow about 30 centimetres per head. Pellets need, if you're using pellets, to be 16 to 18% crude protein. You really need to start them slowly. And you need to make sure that as you start to run out of batches of pellets, that you shandy the new batches of pellets in with what you're currently feeding. Pellets are often made by the manufacturers with whatever grain they have in the silos. And while they will provide them to a certain level of energy and protein, the actual constituent might be a different grain. Could be wheat, could be barley, could be lupins. It does depend what the manufacturer has. But as we know, changing grain without allowing the animal to adjust to it leads to stomach upsets. So when you are feeding pellets, don't just run out and then just put the new batch in. Always shandy it through. So again, planning is important. Don't forget to use a drench and to vaccinate your animals as you bring them in. So now I think we're getting close to having a plan that should be able to have a timeline around it. And you need to, again, be honest about this. If you are thinking about feeding, how long are you prepared to feed for? Given that we're coming up into what could be potentially a very long, hot, dry summer, are you prepared to continue to feed over that period of time? So how many months will that be from now? And then how much money do you have to spend on drought feeding? And how much will it cost you to keep the stock you plan to keep for the months you plan to feed for? These are hard questions, but they will shape your plan in such a way that you can then prioritize and start to find an acceptable outcome for yourself. There is a very useful tool provided by the New South Wales DPI, which is called the Drought and Supplementary Feeding Calculator. And it allows you to start to do your comparisons and start to be able to change and compare feeding different groups of animals, how many you have, and how much you would like to do. It's called the Drought and Supplementary Feeding Calculator. I did a little run with that using the data out of the AFM this morning, using that level of digestibility and the feed that came out of the AFM, and quite clearly, as I expected, it showed that those animals were getting only about half of their daily energy requirements. So we know there is weight loss happening there. So your choice then is, if you are not prepared to allow your animals to lose a half a body condition score in the next month, to intervene with feeding. And you can test different feeds out. I, for this instance, have just used oats as an example, and it will calculate for you the cost per head per day, the cost for a feeding period, and the total feed amount in terms of how much you would feed over the next 30 days, which is the window that we looked at earlier on. It's equally important, and this is often hard, to factor in how much time does it take to feed stock. And that's probably one of the big killers when we start to feed livestock. The app will allow you to start to do feed out. So you can think about whether you do frequency of feeding one day every day or every second day, and the amount that would have to be provided if you were feeding at those rates. How you might feed it, whether you use auger or gravity feed flow out, how fast your auger is, depends how much time you would need to take, and depending on the number of feeders, how much time per feeder. Now that's pretty important if you then factor in how much time you have in a day. If that's taking you 5 or 6 or 10 minutes per feeder and you have to get around, that's a huge amount of time. So again, thinking about this in terms of your plans might actually help you reshape your decisions about how much you value your time as opposed to the actual financial cost of what you spent on those particular animals. In terms of selling stock, we have to make choices, and there's going to be no perfect time. There's never going to be the right time. So you need to make a decision about it. So you could put this as if there was no paddock feed, or if you had to feed for the next 6 months, what are your choices? You might say for the next 4 months. Put the time frame for yourself. So then put down what you might sell and whether you would do it. And then once you've done that, you can then start to think about how you might start to evaluate the potential income. And yes, you know, we'll all say that the results are never going to be what we wanted. And we know that the market is much lower than it was this time last year and is continuing to fall as people have to make these hard decisions. What we also know is that the longer you leave those decisions, the market becomes more saturated. And if you're in a position where you're just holding weight or losing body condition, those animals on a falling market, on falling conditions, continue to lose even more value. So you need to actually be honest about what you expect and whether it's realistic to hold on to them or whether to actually offload earlier and save the financial cost of feeding to do that. It's really important then that you just do the sums. A lot of people don't always do their cash balances, and you can do it fairly quickly in a very simple process like this. So you have to be objective if you're going to feed or sell. And having used these examples and this format that I've provided, you should be able to be much more objective about the decision to feed or to sell. There is a little table here that was developed by New South Wales DPI, which helps you maybe calculate your break-even price. Now, you can change this in terms of the interest foregone on the sale to whatever might be reflective of your interest prices or whatever it might be that you use to fund purchasing of livestock. But you can put the current value of the animals in that you have and the interest foregone on that sale, what the cost of feeding it is, not forgetting then the other costs such as health treatments and the time associated and the cost associated with feeding, any additional income that might come, and then you'll have a total value at the end of that feeding period. And if you expect replacement stock to cost less than that total amount, then you could actually probably sell those stock and come out in front. So be objective about it. Set a break-even price and decide whether you actually will be better off or not. But you need to actually do it in such a format that is actually objective, that you can go back and review based on actual numbers. Don't do it talking in the pub with a beer coaster and two other people who've had a bad experience. You need to be objective and you need to use the data that's actually available. So we're almost close to time. So I'll just throw it now across to our question and answer. And if you have any questions, we can actually go through them. So the first one for Eric Turner is we actually are recording this, and I'll be sending a link to the recording out to you shortly. And to Bronwyn, how you know your digestibility of your feed is that there are two ways. The rough and ready way is to actually look at your feed curves, your pasture growth stages. So short green leafy material is highly digestible, better than 68, 70% digestible. Stalky feed that's gone to head with seeds and has more stalk than stem is around about that 60% digestible. But what we would always encourage every person to do is to actually do a feed test, to take a series of samples, cut that feed, take it off, put it into a bag and send it off. Now, in New South Wales, the feed service is based at Wagga. You can get feed test sample kits from the local land services, and you can send your sample off and you'll get a report back on the energy, the digestibility, the crude protein, and the amount of fiber that's in it. And as we start to do a lot more ration development for people, if things get tighter, then we'll be really looking at using feed tests and understanding what they're telling us about our feed. So that's the most effective ways to do a feed test. In the other states, there are feed laboratories that will also provide you with results. And basically what you're looking for is the digestibility, but they'll also provide you with the megajoules of energy per kilogram of dry matter and the crude protein, and also the fiber levels, the NDIF, neutral detergent fiber, which is also important on impacting the digestibility of that feed. So I hope that answers that for you. I'm happy to take any more questions if there are any others to come. But for those of you who do need to go, I appreciate very much that you've been able to sit through for an hour. If you have joined because you've seen a link somewhere and you're looking for my contact details, they are there on the screen. Please feel free to send me an email, or you can contact me through the website or even through Facebook if you want. And I'll be happy to try and help you refine your plan, or to answer any questions that you might actually have about using the Australian Feed-Based Monitor, and how you might use it to actually work within your own location. I'll be closing the recording very shortly, and once I've uploaded that, I'll be sending a link to you as we go. If there's no other questions, I'm happy to end the session now. Righto, looks like it's all good. Thanks, David. Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much, and please stay in touch if we can help you or to answer any further questions.